success. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another Eat and Greet. And this week we have Master Astrologer Rick Levine, which I'm completely excited for. And I know many of you were very, very excited to see him coming as well. Rick, thanks for coming. This is fun.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I wouldn't have arrived without a proper invitation.
And by proper invitation, I want to be clear that I just stalked him on Facebook until I found him. And that is, if that's what you got to do, you do what you got to do, right?
Yeah, but on Facebook, it's not stalking. You know, if you're in the parking lot with a telescope, that's stalking. You know, but Facebook can't be stalking because it's public. But thanks for the invitation, nonetheless.
Yes, and you brought your beverage in the best solar eclipse cup I've ever
did.
seen.
I have a cup that I got from the August fixed mid-Leo total eclipse that I experienced along with a few hundred other astrologers at the August 1999 eclipse in Plymouth, England at the AA conference. That's the Astrology Association of Great Britain. And it was kind of a drizzly, cloudy day. And I remember being on this hill, like a little kind of like the proverbial grassy knoll, just by Plymouth University, by the University of Plymouth. And Rob Hand decided that it would be appropriate if he did a Mercury incantation to the sky to incant the clouds to open up so we could see the eclipse. And so it was very strange having Rob standing there on the top of the hill incanting in Latin. And although it did not work, it was a wonderful moment anyhow.
Right. So sometimes it's really not about the outcome. It's just the moment. And we're having a moment. So hopefully you guys have your beverages or your snacks as well. In true Taurus style, I am into a good snack for an event. And we're going to talk about transits today. So whether you're new, whether you've been doing this for a while, I think especially if you've been doing this for a while, I enjoy hearing other people's takes on.
Oh, there's no end to that. I believe that any competent astrologer can, and even a long-term practicing astrologer, always gains. I mean, you and I both just got done with a weekend of virtual NORWAC, the Northwest Astrological Conference. And I sat in like so many lectures, and I'll hear others, people talking about things that I kind of know and I've known for years, but there's always things you pick up. There's always takeaways you learn. There's no end to the depth and width of the astrological planetary archetypes. And as long as you're learning, you're young. As soon as you stop, you're learning, you're old.
Yeah, there you go. Your audio is kind of going in and out for a second.
Okay. Well, okay. I'll do the best I can.
Okay. We'll love you for whatever you do, for sure. All right. Well, shall we jump into it and talk about what these transits are, since we're here to do some learning? So if you are kind of new or you just have never even heard of a transit, in a way, it's really exciting to see that things keep moving and keep moving on. And on the other hand, it's sad to find out still yet again, it's not just all about us. When we were born, our natal charts, we created a stamp in the sky of this energetic pattern of who we are. Those planets were there. That's our little signature. But those planets moved on and continued to work in the world and in our lives as well. So as we talk about transits, those are the planets that have continued to move, and they will bring influences back into the chart. And as that influence of the moving planet, that brings the event or whatever it is asking us to work on. It touches things within our natal charts, and those are the pieces of us it stimulates us to do something with. So if we have Mercury transiting, so he's the one that's moving, he's asking us to communicate, to make decisions. Maybe he's retrograde, he's asking us to look back at decisions we've made. And maybe it's touching something with your Venus, and we're going to stimulate the portions of you that talk about affection, that talk about relationships, financial things. So that's what transits in a very nutshell do. But we want to talk today about what each of the transits bring to the table as well, so you know how to work with them. What does it mean when Pluto's coming through an area of your chart? You don't have to get under a rock and hide. It's actually quite useful. Yeah.
No, I'm gonna say something that might be very revolutionary, but I actually stole this idea. Being a Gemini rising, that's what I do. I steal ideas from others. But it's like it's not stalking if it's on Facebook because it's public. It's not stealing if you announce where you got the information.
Fair
But
enough.
Grant Louis wrote a book called Astrology for the Millions. And in it, he has this brilliant piece where he talks about how the planetary energies are really all the same. And this is my words on top of his words aren't exactly this. But it's like if someone came over for dinner once a month and you had a drink and then you had dinner and then you played a game of chess or cards and then he or she went home, and that happened every month on a very regular basis. And one time that person comes over, has a drink, has dinner, plays a game of cards, and stays for a year, and then goes home. It's the same event, but because of the timing, it becomes very different. And this is the difference between a fast moving lunar or solar transit. We know that the sun doesn't move theoretically from our point of view, but it looks like it does. And sometimes we forget that. I mean, most people have a weekend that, oh, I love the first week of fall, or every year on the second, mid-August is a really awful time for me, or whatever. And often those are solar transits because the sun repeats. It's the only thing that repeats every year. But the moon transits repeat every month. That's what a month or a month is. Meanwhile, a Pluto transit can last for 3-5 years and will never repeat because it's a 250 or 240, 5-year cycle. And so the difference of the planets and what their impact is really the frequency. It's like hearing a musical note or chord, and some chords sound good and other chords are a little bit tougher. Some are more complicated, and we can hear the difference between the notes, but they're all just vibration. And all the transits are vibrations, and all we are is our radio receivers. We're picking up the vibrations, but we're picking it up on a radio that has its own particular tuning, which is what you referred to as, the imprint of the cosmos at the moment we were born, our own particular pattern. And so it's like we are all radio stations that are also receiving the broadcast of this moment every moment.
All the time. And sometimes we like some songs.
And sometimes we don't. And the difference is that we can't just turn the damn radio off because the song keeps playing.
Yeah, like when have you ever seen that movie, Inside Out, the Disney movie?
No.
Oh, it's funny. It goes through the psychology of like what lives in your head. And there's this one scene where, randomly you get a song stuck in your head and they keep handing the guy the gum commercial. And he's like, that's not why am I thinking about that? It's like that sometimes.
It's like that.
It's like that. All right. So shall we go through the planets and talk about what their transits bring in?
Sure. But before we drill down on any one of them, let's just put in our minds that some planets move fast and some planets move slowly, like I already said. And the slower the moving of the planet, the heavier, the more complicated, the more pressing the issue is. But it doesn't always seem that way. And it's the difference between, now I'm not saying that a transit is a disease, because it can be very, very positive. A transit being the point at which a planet in the sky is making contact with a planet in my chart in some way, resonating with my radio station, with my radio receiver, with my chart, with my being. But the interesting thing here is that we have to understand the difference in disease of an acute and a chronic disease. Because a chronic disease, chronic coming from the word chronos, which is Latin for Saturn, which is Greek for Latin, which is let me do that again. Chronos is Greek for Saturn, and Saturn is Latin. So Chronos, which means time, Saturn being father time, a chronic disease is one that has developed over a long period of time. You're not going to take a quick fix and get rid of a chronic disease because it's taken a long time to develop, and it'll take a while to get rid of if you do the right things. Now, a chronic disease can settle in and it can be incredibly debilitating. But an acute disease is one that happens really fast. It might only be a 3-day disease. It might be a COVID-19 with pulmonary, situations that that are very, very difficult. The point is that just because it's a faster moving planet doesn't mean that it's a lightweight, even though it's not as significant as the slower moving heavyweights. And the way it works is that usually the sun, moon, Mercury, Venus, even Mars, which are the fastest moving planets, they often act as triggers to other things that are being set up by these slower moving, longer lasting patterns.
Right. So when we think about this in the chart, we kind of have a nice little guide that we can follow those cycles quite quickly because they go so long, right? Like when we're looking at Jupiter, you've got 12 years engaged in this somewhere. We've got Saturn who's going to sit in place you've got a 30-year cycle attached to that, 5 years at a time. We look at Pluto, and Pluto is just in place for a long time. That's a slow moving guy. So I always think about Pluto as a gift that he moves so slow, because with that level of transformation and evolution, if we had to do it all in 5 days, I think we'd all fall off the planet. That's deep work. So nice, slow. The universe is kind. So it gives us time.
The other thing about transits, before we drill down on the planets individually, is that except for the sun and the moon, all the quote unquote true planets, because remember the word planet comes from the Greek planeta, which means a wanderer. So all the things up there in the sky that moved were all considered planets. When astrologers say, isn't it terrible that Pluto's no longer a planet? I go, who the hell cares? When an astronomer thinks, remember the sun and moon, we know are not planets in the astronomical sense, but they're still wanderers from Earth's point of view. And so it doesn't matter what you label them. But the thing is that as we look at the sky, all the true planets, meaning Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Chiron, Eris, blah, 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 10,000 asteroids, 40 or 50 centaurs, and whatever else you might be using. All these things, when they get close to Earth, we lose perspective and it looks like they go backwards. We call that retrograde motion. Most people know Mercury retrograde because it turns retrograde 3 times every year for about 3 weeks. Right now, we're in a retrograde season with Venus, which is the least often retrograde planet, with Venus retrograde and Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto all retrograde right now. And so what happens is that let's say this eclipse cup is the transiting planet and I'm the natal chart. And normally the planets just move across that, bing, that's the point, and they keep going. But during a retrograde, a planet will come across that point, and from Earth's point of view, it then goes across that point backwards, and then it goes across that point forward a third time. And so from a standpoint of really understanding transits, if one is going to look at the dates that a particular planet is transiting a point in a chart sensitive, and we see 3 of them very close together, close together within the year even. When we see 3 points like Saturn conjunct someone right now is a late Capricorn or very early Aquarius. Saturn moving from Capricorn to Aquarius would have lined up with the sun, and now it's turning retrograde and it'll line up that point again, and it'll go again. And that's about an 8 or 9 month period of time between that. So the trend is going back to what you said earlier. The transit is now taking 8 or 9 months. For another person, might just happen once, because when it retrogrades, it doesn't come back that far. And yet I've heard people complain, oh, I'm getting this 3 times rather than once. And I say, that's a blessing. You have more time to work with it and to incorporate it, so you don't have to leave the planet in freaking out as to when it goes down just on a Thursday afternoon.
Absolutely. I think that that is the gift of time as well, especially if it does happen to be Saturn. It is genuinely the gift of time. You will be so crystallized, hopefully, over those lessons and those experiences. By the time Saturn moves on, you'll be like, oh yeah, that old 8 months, I've got it in the bag. I'm good to go.
Well, Saturn is a bit of a dance, because obviously if something is too fluid, it becomes punished by Saturn, because Saturn needs structure. But if something doesn't maintain fluidity at all, or movement or animation at all, that's what we call death. And Saturn's not, and it's not like a Saturn transit means you're going to die, but certain parts of us die during a Saturn transit, because we're forced to give up something that we can't keep active and fluid and animated and in motion. So it's a dance.
It's a dance, but he's like, I always teach that Saturn is looking for our greatest spiritual maturity, but there's some self-sacrifice that comes with that if you'd like to level up and do what the gift of time, I think, gives all of us, which is grow up in public and grow up on the inside in public. So
my now late great astrology buddy and partner in crime, Jeff Jower, used to say that Saturn, that if you have a life situation going on, Saturn's the planet that says no but means yes. And what he meant by that was that often we blame Saturn for what doesn't work, because Saturn presents obstacles or resistance. It's sometimes referred to as the taskmaster or the tester. But in fact, Saturn is really, although it's saying no, it's actually saying no so that we get our shit together, because Saturn wants us to succeed. But it does that by forcing us to contract and to pull in and to be disciplined and to do the work. So we have to be careful about these quick judgments that come to us either from another astrologer or from old textbooks that say this planet is bad and that planet is good. It just doesn't work that way. The universe in itself doesn't have bad and good. It just has vibration. It's how we respond and how we work with energy that turns it into our value judgments of bad or good.
Yep. You heard it here.
Yep.
You heard it at the meet and greet.
And this is in disagreement with some of the ancient practices, not all of them. I know numbers of Vedic, that's, Indian or Hindu astrology, Vedic practitioners, and Hellenist who would certainly agree with what I just said. And yet the language was such a different time. The language is very judgmental and very black and white. This is good, this is bad, this is afflicted. No, square Saturn is an affliction. I mean, that's the word to use to describe that. And yet it may take more work, but often it's the charts that take more work, if the person is willing to do more work, that achieve higher levels of excellence and, not to co-opt your name, but grace.
Yeah, well, this channel, I chose Grace. Stormie is my name, but Grace is the chosen name because Grace is the slack the universe cuts us for being assholes. And I need a lot of that. That's where that comes from. So, yes.
Well, it's also it's also the slack that we cut for ourselves, because that then becomes projected, and that's what we perceive and get back from others and from the universe.
Yes, and we're coming into high retrograde season, so
we're not coming into it, baby. We're here. We are.
I'm just waiting for Mercury. I feel like, come on, Mercury, get in the butt, and we'll be ready to go.
Yeah, but by the time Mercury gets into it, Venus is all ready to go. I'm out of here. So it's you know what it is? It's like a relay race, because once Mercury goes retrograde and then turns direct, then even though Venus is going direct and even though Mercury is going direct, then Mars comes into Aries, and Mars in Aries is a house on fire. That's where that's Mars's home sign in the spirit of full astrological disclosure. I am a Mars in Aries. So Mars comes blazing into Aries, and then it turns retrograde and hangs out in Aries for 8 months and goes, I ain't going nowhere.
Yeah.
So retrograde season ain't over, or as I like to say, it ain't over till it's over. And
Not
even
even close.
and even then, it ain't over. This is Pluto. See, Pluto by transit, the lesson that Pluto brought us when we began to culturally learn about and integrate the outer planets, Neptune, Pluto, even Chiron and Eris, Neptune and Pluto in particular, is that Saturn at one point in time was the absolute finality limit. Saturn was the end of the line. Saturn was the gate from the soul's entry from out there somewhere into the three-dimensional animated world in which we live here on Earth. Saturn was the gate that Lucifer came through and became a fallen angel. In fact, etymologically, Saturn and Satan are the same word. And it's just we, from the Judeo-Christian tradition, have such a negative spin on being in this world because it originated from original sin, and therefore anything that's fallen through the gates of Saturn or Satan is negative, and anything out there is divine and beautiful and perfect. And we now know that Saturn is not the finality. In fact, Saturn is the illusion that there's finality, and Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which used to be thought of as out there and transfer there, that's where the action is. And Pluto's lesson to Saturn, and I think Liz Green once wrote that that Pluto's Saturn's only friend.
You gotta have a buddy, right?
Well, but you see, the thing is that the lesson here is that often Saturn transits feel like it's the end of something, the end of a job, the end of a family situation, the end of a marriage, the end of some illusion that you were harboring as something that had to do with who you thought you were.
Sure.
But Pluto comes along and says, no, the end is never the end. The end is always the entry into a process that is a metamorphosis, that is how the caterpillar ends up being a butterfly. And Saturn just says, nope, caterpillar dead, done, over, game over, done. But Pluto says not the case.
Yeah. So they've got to kind of work and travel together, because you got to become the next thing. Plus, time is so brilliant. Time and schedules and these little planners are just such a beautiful way for us to pretend like we are in control of something.
Albert Einstein said that time, what do you say? Time is an illusion, albeit a very persistent one.
Yes. Yes, which is why I just love when somebody's like, I got a new planner. I'm like, cool. Good job. You'll know, in a sense, where to be.
In Indonesia, in Bali, where I spend a fair amount of time, in Balinese, there's a word where a Balinese person might say, I'll meet you at 3:00, jam karet. And jam karet kind of translates into time is rubber. It really means the two words are time and rubber, but it's like island time.
Sure.
It's like this illusion of the tick tock. Every minute is exactly a minute long. Every hour long, and that there's a mechanical thing. Time never was that way until we Westerners developed gears. Prior to that, time. Think of the difference in your understanding of the universe. If you were just born 200 miles apart, let's say from northern Italy to southern Switzerland, and your understanding of time. In Italy, the understanding of time is an emotional construct.
Yes.
And yet in Italy, there's an absolute mechanical precision. And so we have to be careful about laying on to the universe. We say the universe is 18 billion years old. 18 billion years doesn't mean shit. It's a little measurement made by this little tweaky planet going around a pretty insignificant sun in a galaxy that's not a very large galaxy, that's actually one of hundreds of trillions of galaxies. And yet we think the whole universe is going toward this particular little rhythm that we call 18 billion years. It's crazy.
Well, we have that rubbery time phrase here in the United States too. We say ish. 3-ish.
That's right.
That is how
right.
we compliment the rest of the world, with 3 little letters.
It's true. It's very good. It's very good.
Brilliant. Right.
Yeah.
Ready to get to the individuals of this. People are asking for it, and they love you, by the way.
Sure. Take me away. Where are we going to start?
Calgon. We're the moon. That guy is whipping around. 28 days and we're out.
So here's the day. If you have a moon transit, it's not going to last very long, because and the word mood, in fact, you can substitute for moon, because, you know, if you're sitting at breakfast one day and you're reading the newspaper with your husband or wife, or friend or lover or parent or kid or whatever, and you look over the newspaper and you go, oh my God, how did I get into this? You know, and you put the newspaper back up above you and go, oh shit, I'm in trouble. I really, you know, this is like my worst nightmare come true. I'm stuck with this person. And by noon, everything is fine. You know, you've forgotten about it. You're back in love with the person, or everything's cool. And if that happens once a month, you can live with that. You know, it's just something happened that tripped you up. But if that feeling stays, that's not a moon transit. It's a Mars transit or a Saturn transit. So moon transits are very acute, and they often trigger deeper, longer lasting planetary transits, but there are changing moods. And the thing about the moon is that it moves fast enough in the sky that it's always changing. It's always waxing or waning. And it happens often enough that when we realize where we are, if we pay attention and one day we're out for a drive with our spouse and we look and we go, oh man, and we go, oh no, I get it. I've had this feeling before. I'm just in a bad mood. And if you recognize it, that's what astrology allows us to do, is to recognize the patterns. So it's not that moon transits can't be significant, especially if they're full moons or new moons or eclipses. They can be incredibly significant, but they're short lasting. However, they can trigger longer lasting events.
Absolutely. And you become unable to hide from what has been revealed to the intuition.
Yeah. And then the next planet out time-wise is the sun. We talked a little bit about that earlier, but as the sun moves through the chart, it just shines its light. It vitalizes, and we can watch, and we astrologers sometimes tend not to pay attention to solar transits. They absolutely are transits. And so depending upon, and it's like I said earlier, it's why we like certain times a year or have a difficult time. You know, if the sun mid Leo in August is square 6 planets that we have in Taurus, we might not like that time of year. It might bring us difficult issues. But the sun lightens, and I don't mean enlightens, but it brings light to the shadows wherever they are as the sun is moving through that part of our chart.
Yes. Light, heat, life, and vitality show up. Hopefully
show up
them.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yep. All right. Mercury.
So Mercury becomes the first of what we call the personal planets, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. And we can almost do these in one sweep together, but we'll separate them out because Mercury is how you think, Venus is what you like and don't like, and Mars is how you get it or stay away from it or defend it. So with Mercury is sometimes considered a lightweight, and it's not. But that's Mercury's dual personality. Mercury is the trickster. Mercury is mischievous on one hand. Mercury is clever, and Mercury is witty. But on the other hand, Mercury is also the psychopomp. He was the god that was given the task of taking souls into the underworld. There's nothing lightweight about that. And Mercury was the only Olympian god who could do that, because Mercury did not lose its identity. I say it because mythologically, some of the gods are, gendered, and Mercury is a hermaphrodite, and therefore Mercury is an it or a he, she, or a they. But Mercury could go both ways, and he could go both in this world and in the underworld. He was both male and female, and it was also very much a lightweight and a heavyweight. So Mercury is how we think. It's not only how we talk, it's how we listen. It's the information coming and going, because Mercury is always, if we look at Mercury back in relationship to the sun, here I'm now the sun, and this eclipsed cup is Mercury. So the planets go around and then they go behind, they go around like that. But if we just look at Mercury in relationship to the zodiac, as the sun is moving through the signs, Mercury just moves back and forth across the sun. That's its retrograde 3 times a year. So Mercury kind of becomes like this pendulum, tick, tock, sending, receiving. It's breathing, inhale, exhale. Mercury is the word mercantile or merchandising. Mercury words, because they involve a giving and a taking. That's what Mercury is. So Mercury is how we use language to give and take ideas and thoughts, and how we communicate. And so when Mercury is transiting through our chart, it often activates the mind. If Mercury is lining up or making an aspect to your moon for a few days, or if it's retrograde or even stationary, meaning just turning retrograde or direct. Mercury, if it lines up with your moon by conjunction, same degree, or opposition, opposite degree, or square, 90 degrees, or even a trine, 120 degrees, and so on. When Mercury lines up with your moon, your words might be more emotional impact. They might be more feeling based. They might be more intuitive. But when Mercury moving through the sky lines up with your own Mercury, you might be way more analytical and logical and rational. When Mercury lines up with your Venus, when you speak, you may say things nicely, even though you're saying you're an asshole. Somebody can say it and get away with it, because Mercury lining up with Venus can be charming.
It is charming. That's how I got all these eat and greets going.
But when Mercury lines up with Saturn, you got some serious stuff to say or to hear, because when Mercury and Saturn get together, the communication is heavier, because Saturn has to do with that finality or the illusion of finality or reality. And when Mercury moving through your chart lines up or makes an aspect to your natal Uranus, you may have crazy ideas that are totally outrageous and ingenious, and some of them may be valuable and most of them may be not. But that aspect can make one person crazy and another person absolutely excited. Yeah. So we have to be even careful about how we judge whether an aspect is good or bad, because they're neither. It's just how we work with it. If you're a Taurus and have Mercury in Taurus, and along comes an aspect of transiting Mercury to your natal Uranus, it might be really hard for you to take, because the Taurus parts of you likes things that are stable and sensible, and yet another person who's an Aquarius, who has that same aspect, when Mercury comes through and makes that aspect, they'll go, wow, is this cool or what? They'll be buzzing, they'll be flying. Anyhow, that's Mercury. Or we could go on, but that's Mercury.
But that's Mercury. Venus, when she comes around, this is nice. She's a benefic. Venus is nice. I just like.
Oh,
Venus.
there you go. There you go with those words, good and bad.
I know, but I do love that, just from personal experience, she's usually trying to bring a little something, and that's very nice. I haven't had a bad experience yet, but I've also not been doing this for 30 years.
Yeah, and how is Venus aspected in your birth or natal chart?
So I have her at 0 degrees Aries opposite, or Aries, Venus in Aries opposite Mars.
You said that, yeah.
Yes, and sextile to my Mercury.
Okay. So that sextile to Mercury actually gives her a way to move intellectually and talking. My point is that what you said is absolutely true, except there are people who have real trouble through their whole life with any planet, good or bad. People who move through life with Saturn as their best friend. Saturn is a malefic. And there are people who move through life with Venus as their undoing. And so although I understand the terms, and yes, typically Venus is easier than a transit of Mars, typically. Too much of anything is not a good thing, even though our friend Mae West said that too much of a good thing is a good thing. The fact of the matter is that Venus typically is the planet that's associated with aesthetic perfection, love, beauty, nice things, sensuality, and I don't mean sexuality. I mean of the senses. You know, good food, nice sheets, good linen, nice wine, good music, a massage with good oil. These are things that impact our senses. And Venus is very much our affinity to having material or physical being. Even Venus shows up in two ways, because in Taurus, she's very physical, but in Libra, it's more the idea of what's nice. And so regardless, when Venus comes through our chart, she often reveals, and I'm referring to her as a she because Venus, regardless of what gender one identifies as, doesn't matter. Venus is a self-identified feminine energy, and she likes sensual connection. And from that standpoint, that sounds like it should be a good thing. But if we're born with a natal Venus conjunct or square Saturn, we may have adjusted our life to understand that we never seem to quite get that sense of love and beauty from sensual connections that other people seem to get. I'm not sure that's always true, but that would be a way of looking at it. But when Venus comes through the chart, she often brings nice things. Now that sounds nice, except sometimes they can be a real distraction. We can be working on our PhD thesis and have deadline, June 15th. We get a Venus transit, let's say over our Uranus, and we meet someone who goes, because Uranus is sudden action and it touches something that's totally unexpected and out of the box, and boom, and we recover from this a couple of week amazing experience. We realize, oh shit, we missed our deadline. So Venus isn't always a good thing. Now, when Venus actually moving through the sky lines up with Saturn, on one level, that can be really difficult because it might feel like we're not getting the love and appreciation and recognition and money and the sense of value that we carry. We're not getting that reflected. But on the other hand, those might be the best times for us to learn what we need to do in order to get to where we want to get to. You see, Venus goes around the sun every 224 and a half days. The Earth goes around the sun once every 365 and a quarter days, roughly. 365 and a quarter divided by 224 and a half is 1.62. 1.62 is the golden mean, the divine proportion, the number that the Greeks associated with beauty. It's the ratio in the Great Pyramid, in the Parthenon, in all the great European cathedrals. It was the secret of stonemasons. It was the book that Leonardo da Vinci illustrated on the beauty, on the aesthetics of beauty. In fact, the book, the Da Vinci Code, is based upon these things called the Fibonacci numbers that Da Vinci was into. But this all goes back to the point that as Venus is going around the sun, it catches up with Earth 5 times every 8 years. 5 divided by 8, or 8 divided by 5 is 1.62, which is the golden mean. Venus is in the sky, the ratio of beauty and perfection. However, love isn't always pretty. And Thomas More, the guy who wrote Soulmates and Care of the Soul and The Reenchantment of Soul in Everyday Life, brilliant writer. The first book he wrote was a book called Dark Eros, and in it he used as an example the Marquis de Sade, who had a very strong Venus in his chart. Point being that Venus and or Eros has a dark side also. And so we have to be, and his whole point, at least Thomas More's point, that you get to pick and choose. And you go into love, once you go into that attraction, you have to deal with it all. that it's superficial to think that you can just cherry pick the stuff that you like rather than having to deal with all aspects of it. So from that standpoint, Venus is also tricky in transit. What you see is all what you get. But as Venus moves through the chart, And I'm not really disagreeing with you as much as it sounds like I am. I'm just an Aries with a fiery Mars. But the fact is that when Venus moves through the chart, she typically brings a sense of longing, desire, a sense of attraction, a sense of sweetness, beauty, whether we realize it or not, whether we have it manifested three-dimensionally or not, we can actually see how, as she makes aspects to the various planets in our chart, that it's typically nicer, easier, sweeter than, let's say, Mars. Because Mars, which to the Greeks was a malefic, meaning a badass, bad boy. But you know, we have to remember that bad boys have their attraction. Look, I'm
They
a
sure do,
Mars
don't
guy.
they?
And they sure do. But just like Mama said, you know, Mama Venus Moon Mama said, they're dangerous. They're trouble. Stay away from them. They're trouble. Mars is sometimes called the angry red planet. Mars is, in fact, hot. It is assertive, and assertion gone awry becomes aggression. In fact, when we hold the energy of a planet in, it often needs to overcompensate and turn into something that's not as healthy. Mars held in can turn into, for example, unnecessary anger or violence or aggression. But a healthy Mars is simply going to fight for justice, fight for what it knows it needs. It's going to fight to protect its home and its family. And Mars is physical. Remember, Venus and Mars were the cosmic lovers. You know, Venus was the feminine gendered aspect, and Mars was the masculine gendered aspect, although both Venus and Mars had a masculine and feminine, or more correctly, a yin and yang. There was Venus the warrior, and there is Mars the lover. And here we should say something about the problem of modern astrology, where we've taken these newly discovered planets, rightfully so, I think, and given them to certain signs that in ancient astrology were covered by another planet. And so when we discovered Pluto, if Mars was a bad boy and Saturn was even worse, well, then Pluto is the ultimate bad boy. I mean, this is the Lord of Darkness. You know, this is James Dean gone awry. This is Mick Jagger. This is, I mean, there's some, I'm sure there are better, illustrations of that energy. But the point here is that Mars in ancient astrology was connected not only with the fighter, the warrior, Aries, but was also connected to Scorpio, the lover, the intensely passionate being. And so we have to remember that by transit, although we monitor that wet, watery, scorpionic side of Mars, we've now thrown it onto Pluto. We've also taken that away from Mars, but it doesn't mean that Mars still doesn't carry that. Mars has always carried that. And so from that standpoint, as Mars comes around in our it may fire up energy. Again, Venus is what we like, Mars is how we get it. Mars is a physicality of love rather than the attraction to the sweet and sensual. Mars is the more intense side of it. So as Mars comes through the chart, we may find ourselves, let's say Mars line up with your natal moon. Before we had Mercury line with the moon, and again, whether it's by conjunction, same degree, opposition, opposite degree, square, any aspect, trine. When Mercury lined up with the moon, that indicated that there would be a connection between the moon, your feelings, your gut, your response, your need to nurture and care for others or be cared for yourself, and speaking. So Mercury moon was going to be an emotional communication. Venus moon was going to be an emotional embracing and attractiveness that would be like a sweetness of, not necessarily in language, but maybe in gesture, maybe in just feeling, or in just how you sensed someone or something else. Mars lining up with the moon by any of those aspects is often translated into action. So when Mars lines up the moon, we may either appropriately or inappropriately express love or anger or misplaced anger, which is often how it's expressed in our unhealthy culture. Jung once said that no amount of politics, in the last book he wrote called The Undiscovered Self, he wrote, no amount of politicians and treaties will ever make war go away. The only thing that will make war go away is the salvation of all souls on the planet, because war is basically a misplaced and projected sense of anger and hostility and or fear that we have on the inside. So that if we dealt with these planets on an individual basis, including Mars, we wouldn't necessarily have to project them culturally and therefore name diseases after foreign countries.
Because we're sneaky like that, huh? Something like that, huh?
So that's Mars, and Mars is sometimes not as easy to deal with. But if you have Mars in your chart that's trine the sun, or Mars is, if your Mars is in some way in your chart easily aspected, when you get an aspect to Mars, it's playing your radio station of Mars, and it might be a time where you can go into action with greater ease than you do at other times. However, you need to pay attention that your action is appropriate, because Mars tends to overheat. It tends to just, to not regulate. And here's an interesting thing about Venus and Mars, because the whole John Gray empire was built upon women are from Mars, Venus and Mars in the boardroom, Venus and Mars in the bedroom, and all relationships are relationships between Venus and Mars. I think that's terribly unhealthy, because I think we moderners know that every person has both Venus and Mars. And as long as I project my need for Venus onto you, you'll never give it to me in the way that I would give it to myself if I were expressing my own Venus. And the same with a woman owning her own Mars and not needing a guy to, hammer in the nail or whatever. And I don't mean that physically, I mean it metaphorically. But the point here is that with the Venus and Mars dance, it's like, as we engage in the planets and learn to express them healthfully, then we actually can engage in a relationship with someone else who's expressing them healthfully, without expecting someone else to fill in holes of our missing aspects in our chart that we're projecting onto others and expecting others to bring to our, unfulfilled party.
Yeah, I think that could be like a whole other talk. We could fit an hour just in on that alone.
I just did a an 8-hour weekend workshop on that topic. So yes, God. Absolutely.
So you're like, I'm sure that we could.
So Jupiter,
the big guy.
Malefic or benefic?
Well, today we've learned that he could just as easily be neutral.
Well,
however, big benefit. I choose him as the big benefit guy. However, he's very big, so when he gets excessive, that's a problem.
Anyone who thinks that Jupiter is a good planet, and I'm not saying that he being a king, I'm not saying that he is not a good planet, but anyone who thinks that Jupiter is always good just needs to think of some sort of carcinoma or cancer cell. Mm-hmm. Because cancer cells are simply Jupiter without being restrained by Saturn. You see, Jupiter expands, and Jupiter is inside the orbit of Saturn. So Jupiter expands, but it can only expand up to Saturn, which constrains. So once Saturn, we're at the next level of planets. Remember, the sun and the moon are the lights. They create shadows. Mercury, Venus, and Mars are the personal planets. They are how we think. They're what we like. and they're how we get what we like, or how we defend what we like from other people taking it from us. Mercury, Venus, and Mars. When we get to Jupiter and Saturn, Jupiter is how we expand beyond our personality into the social realms, into the outer world. It's how we grow. It's the idea of big. You said it. I mean, Jupiter is B word, beneficent, big, baby, belly, buoyant, the optimism, the puff, these words that have gas that build up and pop, explode, big. These are all Jupiterian kind of words. The thing about Jupiter is that it can't go forever because it is always existing within the confines of Saturn. Now, once Jupiter breaks free from Saturn, then we have well, it's good news and bad news. But on one hand, we have a Cancer system, which is normally restrained by the rules of how much it can reproduce, and therefore it's not cancerous. But when it becomes Jupiterian without regards to the rules, it ends up killing the host that it's living in because it doesn't know when to stop growing.
Sure.
So Jupiter isn't always good. However, if it recognizes the rules, then Jupiter becomes our way of expanding as much as we can while still respecting structures. Incidentally, Neptune is simply Jupiter who's escaped from Saturn. No, and interestingly enough, in traditional astrology, Jupiter ruled Sagittarius and Pisces, meaning that Sagittarius and Pisces were both considered to be signs that Jupiter was at home when he was there. We modern astrologers have taken the wet, watery, emotional side of Jupiter away from him and given it to Neptune, and say, because see, if you can, in your mind, if you're growing, but you have to stay within the bounds of Saturn, you can get philosophical, but you still have to be rational because Saturn is structure and rational. But if you don't have to pay attention to Saturn, then you can dream. Yeah. Neptune is Jupiter that can expand forever. It's immense. It's infinite. It's the realm of imagination that has no bounds. Jupiter has bounds. The bounds are Saturn. So when Jupiter moves through your chart, the question becomes how you use that transit to grow without growing so far, so hard, so fast, so much. Use balance. Because Jupiter doesn't indicate success. It only indicates the potential for success. And it's like being on the old merry-go-rounds where they had the golden ring every now and then, and you reached, and if you're on the outer horse on the carousel, you would reach and you would grab a ring, and most of them were either tin or bronze. But if you got the gold ring, that meant you won a prize. So the thing is, if you didn't reach, you had no chance of winning the prize. But if you reached too far, you'd fall off the damn horse. And so whenever we have Jupiter transits, we have to balance and keep aware that if we don't reach, we won't grow. But if we reach too hard, too fast, too much, we actually can create imbalance. And Saturn will quickly come in and make us pay for it.
Where is your Jupiter, out of curiosity?
Out of curiosity, my Jupiter is at 29.5 degrees of Capricorn. It's the only planet in Earth that I have. Traditional astrologers would say that Jupiter is debilitated in Capricorn because Jupiter is exalted in the opposite sign in Cancer. And yet I think my Jupiter in Capricorn it prevents me from gaining the amount of fame that someone else might have. I'm okay with that because I feel on the ground. I'm the one who, even though I have so many planets in Aries and a Gemini rising, and I'm quick to say yes to almost any crazy idea that comes down the pike, I'm also the one that goes, no, this is why this won't work. And let's think, there's a part of me that really is very much, constraining. But my Jupiter is at the very, very last degree, last half degree of Capricorn. I would even say it's and want to be, but it couldn't quite wait.
It's trying. Well, it just makes sense because I think about Jupiter too when I look at people and I watch what they're doing as their outer expanded teacher. So I'm always interested where people's Jupiters are at, and yours does seem nicely matured. It seems like it's got a good structure to it, which is nice. You know, you bring
Well, the
everybody
only
up and
the
it's
only reason
wonderful.
why it's thank you, but the only reason why it's matured is that I'm still doing what I did and I haven't died yet. So that's what happens when
That's
you
the key. That's the key to longevity. Keep doing the same thing and don't die. Right?
William Blake wrote, and those who have listened to my teachings have probably heard this quote way too many times. But the William Blake quote is, if the fool, think of the tarot card, if the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
But anyhow, so watching Jupiter move around the chart, it's an opportunity cycle. And we can watch Jupiter in particular in relation to the 12-year cycle as it crosses our ascendant, or as it crosses the lights, the moon and the sun, and or its own place, because when Jupiter every 12 years returns to where it was when we were born, it's like the closing of one opportunity cycle and the opening of a new one. And interestingly enough, around age 60, 58, 59, 60, we have our fifth Jupiter return and our second Saturn return that happens simultaneously, which is often an important transition point for people, whether in olden days they were retiring or dying, or in modern days, whether they're beginning a whole new phase of their life.
Yeah. They're no longer want to be an accountant. They're going to kayak and teach it.
An accountant, a kayak accountant.
Yeah.
Anyhow, that brings us to Saturn, and we could do 3 or 4 hour talks on. I could, without even taking a breath, on Saturn, because whenever I talk about Saturn and transits, I hear the song, and if I was properly prepared, I would now cue "We All Need Someone to Lean On," and if you know, because that's what Saturn says: lean on me, lean on me, lean on me. Now, the problem is that we can only lean on Saturn if we've been working on creating the structures of Saturn. Saturn is like a final exam for a course you take in college, and you can't cram for it the night before. I always say you can't cram for a Saturn exam. That Saturn being a 30 or 29 and a half year cycle, you begin study for your Saturn exam half a cycle ago. So it's like what you were doing, either 29 years ago or 14, 15 years ago, and what you've done all the way through now, that determines what will happen. I think of Richard Nixon, who not to, but I think of Richard Nixon, who resigned from being president when Saturn was conjuncting his midheaven. And the first election that he and his group of friends that he called the plumbers, the first election that they fixed, or that they kind of messed with, was in Whittier, California, 14 years prior. Saturn was at the bottom of the chart. So when Saturn gets to a critical point in the chart, whether it's a midheaven, a transit, or whether it's your sun sign, if you're a Capricorn, you've just had that happening. If you're Aquarius, you have that, you're right at the edge of that. When Saturn gets to a point in your chart that's critical, whether it's the sun or the moon or the ascendant, and whether it's by conjunction or square or opposition, it's kind of karmic in as much as you get what you deserve. And because we're humans, and because we're fuck ups, we don't always get what we deserve in a way that we'd like to think we should. And so we blame Saturn. Oh, it was a Saturn transit. I lost my job. It was a Saturn transit. I was homeless. It was a Saturn transit. My wife or husband left me. It was a Saturn transit. I was unhappy and I quit my job and I didn't have one to replace it. It was a Saturn transit. I got pregnant and wasn't expecting it, and now I'm, now my whole life, whatever it is, things happen. You see, a Saturn transit works like this: you can win the Nobel Prize and have your spouse leave you the same day, because Saturn basically says you get what you deserve. and you can't cram for a Saturn exam. So if you've been putting your effort into your professional work and publishing papers and doing research and doing all those things, and you get the Nobel Prize, good on you. But if you've been ignoring your home and your family and your relationship, and all of a sudden find that you're without any of that stuff, that's the price you pay. Grant Louis, the guy who I mentioned earlier on, said that transiting Saturn conjuncting your natal sun is like having the chickens of ambition come home to roost. If you've been tending them, they come home fat and happy and laying golden eggs. But if you've not been tending them, they come home scrawny, hungry, even sickly, and you don't have the resources to feed them or care for them. But tough shit, they're yours.
Yeah, these are still your chickens.
It's still your
right?
chickens.
Still your circus, still your monkeys.
Exactly. And so Saturn transits are often considered to be difficult. I always think of them as the times in your life when you say, oh, that period really sucked. But I'm really glad it happened, because if it didn't, then I wouldn't, blah, 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 blah. Again, Saturn says no to get to the yes. Saturn makes something fall apart. It makes us leave something. It forces us to deal with something. And again, because we are human, we tend to not be as disciplined or not as structured as Saturn would ultimately like us to be. And so we typically fall short of the divine, of the perfection in one way or another, although Saturn transits can also be incredibly empowering. They can be incredibly, life-changing in a positive way. I mean, I got married and had my only child on my Saturn return, and, and with all the other things in my life I ever did, that might be the, best thing I ever did. And I don't know who's judging, but the point is that Saturn does not, although Saturn is Satan. I think of Liz Green's book, A New Look at the Old Devil. Saturn is not the ultimate bad guy that we once thought. And incidentally, I said bad guy, but even though mythologically Saturn is represented as a male, Saturn is one of those characters that because astrology was written by guys for guys, often male characters are really not it's their gender, it's not their, or it's their sex type, it's not their gender, because because Saturn certainly, the guys have robbed Saturn of being the old wise woman, the crone, the caring grandmother who's wiser than anyone else in the family, and so that is Saturn. It's the wisdom of feminine aging also. And so we have to be careful as we're reclaiming. I say I consider myself more than just a bystander, but reclaiming the feminine aspects of a lot of the masculinized perceptions of reality. I think Saturn is a really good place to start, because Saturn, even though I said guy, we just need to be really careful that Saturn is not, in some ways, like Mercury, but not as obviously. Saturn is not quite as gendered as we sometimes think of the, Judeo-Christian old, bearded guy in a white robe ruling things. He. No, it's he, she, they, Saturn.
Yeah. And I think the longer I continue to practice, I find a more neutrality between everything that's coming across the chart and everything I'm studying in astrology. And I think some people down in the chat are expressing that as well. So,
what are people in the chat saying? Hi, people in the chat. I'm not watching you because I'm chat disabled. I'm chat disabled.
Well, one person, when you were talking about, I believe, Saturn, they said, no shit, Rick, that's correct. So that's like one of my favorites so far. Saturn makes us open our eyes and pay attention to reality, genderless. Yeah.
Here's Saturn right here.
Saturn is on my thing and it's way in the corner, so you guys can't even see it. That's sad.
Yeah, you have Jupiter behind your head, though.
Look at this.
Yeah.
This is so great. This is a new background, so I'm very excited. All right, let's talk about Uranus.
Well, this is, I mean, you have no idea how many 2-hour talks I've given on Uranus, on everything one of my classic talks is everything you ever wanted to know about Uranus, but were afraid to ask. Um, so, so let me
Cliff
come into
Notes
this,
version then.
huh?
The Cliff Notes version then, huh?
Yeah, without going to the, to the Uranus jokes, let me kind of come into this backwards. Did I really say that? Um,
That's good. It's appreciated.
let me give you the punchline first. Uranus only has one job. I mean, when all the planets were put into motion, however that happened, I wasn't there. But when they were put into motion and were each given their job description, Uranus's job description was this. And if you write only one thing down from this entire interview, talk, whatever, this is the piece worth writing down. It's Uranus's job description is the instantaneous resolution of irresolvable opposites. It's the instantaneous resolution of irresolvable opposites. And you might say, well, that's impossible. That's paradoxical. Well, that's Uranus, because Uranus is paradoxical and impossible. But here's the way it works. And I personally find that I've learned the most about astrology by things in nature. I'm kind of an odd mixture between a city boy and a country boy. I was born in New York City, but I grew up near the Adirondacks in what was then a small town in upstate New York. And I grew up hunting and fishing, and no, I don't have guns or fishing poles anymore. But I grew up outside, so to speak, or a lot of my, and here's how to understand Uranus. So in nature, electricity has two charges. It's like a polarity. You can think of it as yin and yang. You can think of it as plus or minus, but it's not plus is good and minus is bad. It's just two different charges. And as it turns out, we agree on what is plus and what is minus charged electricity. So negative polarity electricity turns out to be something that's really healthy for life in general. Life needs negative ions in order for it to grow and feel comfortable. In fact, you can go to many schools. It's called a negative ion generator. Negative ions are created when water mixes with water, especially warm water. So negative ions are generated in a spring rainfall. They're generated at a waterfall. They're generated at the seaside with waves. They're generated with a murmuring or rushing brook. They are relaxing because they're generating negative ionization. So when you have warm air that's mixing with itself, it's creating negative ions. Now you have cold, dry air, and that makes positive ions, which sounds like it should be good, but positive ions are what make us restless. There's an ancient proverb that goes, an ill wind blows no good. An ill wind blows no good. And in every culture, there are winds that are often dry, that are always dry, but often cold and dry. And if you're in Southern California, they're the Santa Anas. If you're in Israel, they're the Sabras. If you're in Switzerland, they're the Fen. If you're in the northern United States, they're the Chinooks. There are winds that when they blow, they agitate us. They make the insects come out. It's the same energy that happens before a storm, that kind of, and these are from the positive ionizations. Okay, so here's what happens in nature. You have some warm, wet air making negative ions. And then you have some cold, dry air that makes positive ions. And these two large air masses come together. And as they come together, they try to work it out because they're intermingling. But unlike what your therapist has told you, communication does not solve every issue. Oh, it's important and it solves many issues, maybe most issues. But we all have certain things in our lives that if we talk about that thing with that person, doesn't go anywhere good. It can't, it won't ever. And so we don't. So this is what happens when the positive ions meet the negative ions and they try to work it out. The more they talk, the more they rub up against each other, the more static that's built, the greater the charge gets. And instead of making it less, it makes it more and more and more until the polarity grows, until it's absolutely impossible for it to resolve. And then all of a sudden, that's Uranus.
That's Uranus.
Uranus is the instantaneous resolution of irresolvable opposites. Now, if you survive the lightning strike, it's usually followed by a nervous laughter of release. Because, holy shit, oh my God, that was well, what happens in our lives is that there are things and there are areas for all of us. It doesn't matter how enlightened we think we may be. There's areas that we just don't attend to, that we bury. And we now know that unlike what we thought in the early 20th century, that the unconscious was a thing in the brain. No, the unconscious exists in every cell of our body. And in fact, what happens is that we bury emotions that are not fully expressed and not fully realized. Every thought, every emotion, negative or positive, gets stuffed. And we stuff certain things in places that eventually create, we're back to the word Saturn or Chronos, chronic dis-ease, where we have a hurt in our ankle or in our knee or an ulcer or restricted this or bones, like that, whatever it is. And these are all results of years and years of armoring, what Rush, a student of Freud's, called armoring, psychic armoring. Uranus comes along and takes those things that are hidden and kapow, brings them into awareness. Uranus is sometimes called the Great Awakener, because when the lightning strikes, it doesn't matter how dark and stormy it is. In that moment, in that split second of lightning striking, you can see everything. You can see the mountains down, outside of town. You can see the car in the junkyard down the block. You can see everything. And then it's completely dark again. But the difference is you remember what you saw. Uranus works like that in our chart. It's not always pleasant. The lightning that came through Yellowstone, big national park in Montana, many years ago, maybe 20 years ago, was considered to be the greatest national disaster in the United States ever. It burned one of the great treasures. And naturalists were like, this is the worst thing that ever happened. Well, now those areas of the park have grown back with greater, more vigorous growth, more wildlife, more plant life. Nikola Tesla, the guy who invented alternating current and the rotary motor and transformer and all that stuff, his experimentation lightning showed that lightning actually electrified and charged the earth, and it was needed for plants actually to grow. So Uranus, a way as it moves through the chart, is that great awakener that revitalizes, re-energizes those parts that have become over-Saturnine, overly structured, so that they have become less alive, because Saturn likes to crystallize things. And if we over-crystallize, we contract and we die. That's what happens to life. So Uranus comes through and reawakens and revitalizes. So when Uranus once every 84 years lines up with your sun, and I'm thinking of all of you who are Pisces, Aries, and Tauruses, about 7 years in a sign. So for the last couple of years, Uranus has been messing around at the beginning of Tauruses. Tauruses are going through their wake-up call. Prior to that, for 7 years, roughly 2010 to 2017, 18, somewhere right in there, Uranus was in Aries. And so Aries sun sign people or Aries moon ascendants were going through their Uranus wake up. Prior to that, for 7 years, it was in Pisces, and so on and so on. So as Uranus comes through the chart, wherever it comes through, it's moving much slower than the sun, moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, even Jupiter or Saturn. But Uranus actually creates this electrification that sometimes we respond to out of fear and we can close down even more, which is not healthy. Or if we can prepare and open ourselves and let go of what Uranus is wanting to take without necessarily having to burn the whole damn forest, well, then we end up being freer. We end up being more open. We end up being more woke, because that's what Uranus's job. Uranus's job is to basically wake us the fuck up. That's what Uranus's job is.
Yeah, well, it definitely worked that way. Uranus came right on over my Venus, and I looked at my husband and I was like, "Oh my God, it's you! What have you been doing here since my Saturn return? Why aren't we married already? What are we doing?" It was absolutely brilliant.
Well, and it creates that sense of urgency and immediacy and instantaneity, because when lightning strikes, it's electrical. It's in the moment. And make no mistake about it, Uranus is electrical like Neptune is magnetic. And it's very strange that in 1819, when Uranus, the planet of electricity, lined up with Neptune, the planet of magnetism, Hans Christian Ørsted, in a physics demonstration lecture in Copenhagen, had an electromagnetic, or had a closed circuit with a bar magnet that he moved back with a voltmeter, and he moved it back and forth across the wire. And he basically, people then knew that magnetism existed, and they were studying it, and they thought it had something to do with electricity, but no one knew what. And at the year of a conjunction between Uranus, the planet of electricity, and Neptune, the planet of magnetism, this conjunction, which only happens every 170 some odd years, that's what Hans Christian Ørsted discovered going toward electromagnetism. You can't make this shit up that good.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
But Uranus is electrical, and the thing about electricity as opposed to magnetism is that, and this from Neptune transits, which we'll get to in a moment, is that magnetism is mysterious. It kind of fades in, builds up, fades out. It's a field. Neptune is the field. Uranus is not the field. Uranus is the current. It's the spark. And an electrical circuit is the on. Go to a light switch on your wall. A light is either on or off. There's no warm-up period. It's instantaneous. That's the way Uranus works. And the louder, no, let me say this the other way. The more the polarity or tension of something that's been hidden, buried, out of the way, the louder the lightning will strike. In the place where I live, in Seattle, we have very little lightning, and it's because it takes the differentiation of the warm, wet, and the cold, dry to make lightning. You get it tremendously through the Midwest, through any place where the air is very dry. I'm sure where you live, you get lightning when it rains, or when. But I lived in Minnesota. In the summertime, we would have lightning storms every night for hours. It was just, that would be the weather. And I remember when I moved to Minneapolis and someone said, "Oh no, it's not going to rain. It's just an electrical storm." I go, "No, there's no such thing." Because where I lived, it always, lightning meant rain. But here in the Northwest,
That's awesome. You're like, well, look at that.
So, but here in the Northwest, because often the rain occurs in the winter months when it's cool, we don't have that huge temperature variation. I remember storms here where you get one clap of thunder, like one loud boom, and that was it. That was the only clap of thunder I would hear for. So it's very weird, but that's Uranus. Uranus is that lightning. And when you look in your chart and you isolate those dates, then you begin to see, how do you react to Uranian transits? You can either react with fright and, oh my God, I'm going to hold on to what I got, or you can understand it's the difference between Western boxing, where it's block and parry, incoming thing, you want to block it, and then you hit back. As opposed to Aikido, which basically says, "Oh, Uranus transit, come on in, boom, boom," and let it ripple through, energize you, and then go out the other side. The problem occurs in astrology is when we resist and when we block. Now, having said that, there is a time for Saturn. We don't want to just, someone wants to only let things go with flow. You know?
Yep. What about Neptune? Let's talk about magnetism.
Well, Neptune is a bit more mysterious. Neptune spends 14 years in a sign. And so when Neptune comes in, it feels like it's not going anywhere. And my best example of Neptune is if you can imagine yourself in pre-steam engine days, sailing a clipper ship from, let's say, England or Boston to Hawaii or to India. In order to go from the northern latitudes around to the Orient to Asia, you had to either go around the tip of Tierra del Fuego or the Cape Horn, the southern tips of South America or Africa, which means you had to cross the equator. Now, what happens on planet Earth is that we have these bands in the northern and southern temperate regions that these winds are constantly blowing. They're called the trade winds because they're what we used several hundred years ago to power the trading ships, the sailing ships. Now, when the sailing ships had to cross the equator, they would go into these areas that banded the equator that were referred to as the doldrums. If you've ever heard the expression, oh, I'm down in the doldrums, what that means is that there's no wind blowing.
So it's kind of wah wah.
So if you're on this journey and you're going along and everything's cool and one day the wind stops blowing, well, you don't know when the wind's going to start again. You may be floating for days, weeks, even months without any wind to catch in the sail, and there's nothing you can do about it, which makes people crazy, which makes people imagine all kinds of shit because you're not being distracted by whatever the next thing is. And we can all look at times in our lives when we thought we were going somewhere to find that whole idea or ideal or goal kind of dissolve, and we just felt aimless or driftless. In a way, that's Neptune, because Neptune's job description, unlike Uranus's, Neptune's job description simply says, dissolve the hard edges of Saturn. So wherever there's a boundary, like a stop sign, that's a boundary. It denotes a boundary, stop. Neptune basically says, don't stop, slow down, or both ways and keep going. And you see, the basic Neptunian substances are the ocean. Neptune is the god of the ocean. And Neptune is also related to alcohol. Now, in the laboratory, alcohol is called the universal solvent because anything that doesn't dissolve in water mostly dissolves in alcohol. That's why we use alcohol as a cleaning agent, because we use, water on something, it doesn't come off. We put alcohol on it, we rub it, it dissolves the dessert. It dissolves the dirt.
It sometimes does dissolve the dessert, doesn't it?
Well, and when we drink it, it dissolves our sense of boundary. You see, this is real astrology. Neptune softens and dissolves the hard edges of the boundaries of Saturn's crystallization or boundaries. And so that is fine if we're taking a sip of alcohol as part of a spiritual ritual, because that little wine that's been used, in spiritual rituals throughout history is often just enough to just dissolve some of that hard edge of Saturn so we can go to places. The problem is when we overdo Neptune, we lose our sense of Saturn, our sense of responsibility, and our sense of boundary. And that's when Neptune can become harmful or dangerous. And in fact, Neptune is toxic. Neptune can be toxic, whether it's Neptune as a gas, or whether it's Neptune as alcohol. But the fact is that when Neptune moves by transit through our charts, it can, in fact, increase the imagination, the spiritual sense, which sounds good if we are spiritually inclined. It can increase the intensity and power of our dreams. But what happens when those dreams become not nice dreams and we can't make them go away? What happens when in a Neptune transit we begin to think that maybe the little twitch that we've had, in our right neck for years, maybe it's now growing and has become a cancer, and we're afraid to go to the doctor to check it out, but that still grows. You see, with Neptune, imagination determines reality. I think again of William Blake's line, what is now proved, Saturn, what is now proved was once only imagined. Or Caroline Casey's wonderful line that Neptune lays the tracks for the reality train to follow. It's like Neptune becomes the imagination that's used to create the scaffolding that we then build our world on. Now, that's great, unless that scaffolding is based upon fear of not knowing what's going on. Then the mind creates these worst case scenarios that, if we don't get checked out, actually manifest, because the mind is what's creating reality. Neptune isn't bad, but Neptune unchecked by the boundaries of Saturn. If someone has a strong Neptune transit going on and they think they have some sort of physical ailment, get the damn thing checked out. Because if it's nothing to worry about, then you don't need to worry about it and you won't manifest it.
Yeah.
If it's something to worry about, then you can deal with it. But the worst thing is to have nothing wrong with you, worry about it, and then manifest it, even if it wasn't there. And that's how Neptune can work. But Neptune is also amazingly creative and imaginative and spiritual. But sometimes it's hard to get traction with Neptune transits because they can be confusing. And the confusion is a brilliant Neptune word, because confusion we normally think of as bad. So do you want to go or no? I don't know, I'm confused. All right, so what is confusion? Word fusion means to melt together. If copper and tin are two separate things and they're melted together, they become fused. But once they cure, they make bronze, which is different than either piece. But if you're copper or if you're tin and you're being fused, you're freaking out going, wait, where's my identity? Where's my identity? And this is what happens to us during a Neptune transit. We lose our identity. It's what happens when we fall in love. The boundary between me and you becomes fuzzy. Neptune's job is to soften the hard edges of Saturn. One of Saturn's jobs is to create the sense of self-identity that is separate from everyone else's self-identities. So if Neptune dissolves that, and I am you as you are me as we are all together, goo goo gajoob, who the knows where we are or what to do about it, we are actually all together. And that's very wonderful and beautiful if I'm living in a commune, or if I'm a spiritual teacher, or if I'm in fact practicing some sort of spiritual bypassing, but I'm not then the dance then becomes managing the balance between the self, which we still are, and this no boundary between myself and others. That's Neptune transits. And Neptune transiting the sun or moon is a very powerful, typically couple to 3 year period. Neptune moves slow enough, as does Pluto, that occasionally it can go direct, retrograde, direct, retrograde, and direct. So rather than just hitting a point once or 3 times, it can actually hit a point 5 times, which can really extend that and confuse the hell out of us if we think we have somewhere to go.
Yeah, so cancel the travel plans, or at least be prepared to adjust. Do half the trip by train and the rest by boat.
Yeah, well, here's the other thing, though, is that with Neptune transits, you might take the most life-transforming, spiritual, magical 2-week journey to Bali to go attend a workshop put on by Rick Levine in Bali, and that might be a Neptune transit where the deeper meaning is not about going to Bali, nor is it about Rick Levine's teachings. It's about that whole piece of that part of you that opens up, that becomes the opening to a journey that you take. So it's not like one shouldn't travel. It's just that one needs to pay it. It's hard to know what is real. It's part of why right now we're going through this whole everything's fake news kind of thing. Anyone who knows what's going on right now, I don't care what they know, they don't. It doesn't matter what side of any political, philosophical, vaccine, Bill Gates, Trump, virus. I don't care what your belief is. You don't know. and neither do I,
Right.
because
We're all in that together.
we're all in that together. And that's Neptune's job. Neptune, especially Neptune at home in Pisces, for 14 years is reality has been dissolved. The Saturnian line between fact and fiction has been dissolved. And it's at one hand very exciting because anything is possible. And on the other hand, it's very confusing and very frightening, because when the ego loses that sense of I know what's going on, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Pluto.
Pluto in power. Let's do it.
Pluto, Roto-Rooter.
Or your nice cup of senna tea, whichever you like to use.
Which is the same thing for those people who know senna tea. Well, no, Pluto's job is Pluto is the planet. Had Friedrich Nietzsche known astrology, when he wrote about what he called nihilism, which was misinterpreted by Hitler and the Third Reich. Nihilism is Pluto. And nihilism is basically those values which have been built up to be the most important values at the top of the mountain of the ideal values that we live for. Nihilism says that those values naturally deconstruct, disintegrate, and fall to the bottom, where they're reconstructed and build up into new values again. And so Pluto's job is to basically deconstruct and reconstruct. Pluto's job is to disincarnate and reincarnate. Pluto's job is to undo the fundamental structures upon which we built our lives, which is frightening. I mean, if we thought Neptune was frightening, not knowing what's going on, well, Pluto basically is actually, I mean, if you're a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, you may or may not know. If you had an ego like we humans have egos, you might think there's no way in hell, double entendre intended, there's no way in hell I'm going to get inside that cocoon, because that's going to kill me. Sure. And so it does. But the caterpillar is simply nature's way of creating butterflies.
Yeah, I teach Pluto as the Phoenix planet. You got to die off in one way to live in the other. Okay,
so the Phoenix, most people know, but the Phoenix is the magical, mythical bird that arises from an egg that is baked in the ashes of the ruins of destruction. Keywords here for Phoenix are ashes, ruins, destruction. And from the egg that's baked in those fires of destruction, the Phoenix arises. And in a way, it's like the butterfly arising from the caterpillar. And Pluto in our chart is each and every one of us recreating or being recreated in a different form. It might feel like we're being deconstructed. It might feel like the end, but here we come back to the illusion of Saturn being the end. We fear death because we fear that death is the end, and yet those who have developed spiritual practices know, or at least people have more realized, that Saturn is not the end. Saturn is just the gateway to the transformation of becoming a metaphysical phoenix, being re-arisen into an altered reality that is butterfly-like. But the caterpillar can't imagine a butterfly. I saw a cartoon once of two caterpillars at the base of a milkweed plant. And at the top of the milkweed plant, there is a butterfly that's just gotten out of the cocoon and is flying away. And one caterpillar says to the other, he goes, "Man, you'd never get me up in one of those contraptions." We can't imagine, as caterpillars, we can't conceive of butterflyness. And it's the ego. The Trungpa Chogyam Rinpoche, the founder of Naropa Institute, crazy Buddhist master, Buddhist in the Vajrayana Buddhist tradition, said that enlightenment is the ego's greatest disappointment. I'll say that again because it's so brilliant. Enlightenment is the ego's greatest disappointment. You see, the ego thinks it's running a show on enlightened, but the ego's like the caterpillar wanting to be a butterfly. As soon as it goes into the cocoon, caterpillar is gone. There's no butterfly yet. And as the butterfly forms, there's no caterpillar. And so our ego has no place in the realms of enlightenment. And it turns out really that we move in and out of that. It's not like, oh, I'm enlightened and then I don't have ego anymore. As long as we're in a body, we come back and forth into that need for survival in our body.
Yeah, well,
so Pluto transits of all the transits are the most intense. They're the most powerful. They're the roto-rooter that basically Pluto takes no prisoners. If there's resistance, Pluto will take it out. If Neptune is the tidal wave, like Christmas tidal wave back 2003, was it? I don't remember. That was in Thailand and Indonesia. That was a full moon tidal wave that happened on a Jupiter Neptune trine. That's a tidal wave is Neptunian, but plutonic changes are like a volcano that'll take out an entire civilization, or even better, a glacier that'll take a century or two to move through an area. But instead of just taking out an island, it'll take out an entire mountain range, forests. The power of Pluto is not interested in your life versus death, any individual situation. It just basically moves through and clears the decks. And often it's the resistance to Pluto that creates the real problems in our lives. And it's a lot easier to say than to do.
oh yeah. Well, it's always easier to say, just become the butterfly. It's like, well, I'm trying. Okay.
Yeah.
I am
But as
trying.
long as you say, I'm trying, who's trying? It's the ego, it's the I, and that's the part that messes us. It's tricky, or it's more than tricky. It's practices, it's practice.
Mhm.
But Pluto transits can be very overwhelming. And I should say something about Saturn and Pluto transits, because they both have the concept of death tied up into them. And as a longtime student of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, I must say that when we talk about death, we're not talking about physical death. We're talking about the little death. We're talking about every death we experience, every time some idea doesn't work, every time someone criticizes us, every time some project fails, every time we get an embarrassing. I love William Blake's, he wanted his epitaph, he wanted William Blake, born 1757, died many times since.
That's the
So,
tick.
so the thing here is that Saturn and Pluto are both associated with death. However, the key here is that when we look at transits, they're often more associated with other people's deaths. That more often than not, in our own chart, if we're dying a healthy death, what do I mean by that? A conscious death, not an accident, but something that happens as part of a process. That often Jupiter is the planet involved. The good luck planet, what's that about? Well, it's about taking a journey. It's about going on a wide and large, expansive journey. But Saturn and Pluto are more involved typically when it's the death of a loved one, a parent, someone else, because there's finality, Saturn, and then there's a transformation of what we go through as we process our loss and grief and then become reborn in whatever our new relationship is with that person. So we need to be careful about putting fear on top of transits in the future, especially those of Uranus and I'm sorry, especially those of Saturn and Pluto.
Yeah, they're best friends. They're hanging out and they're doing good work.
They're buds. They're hanging out on a street corner in what can be a nasty neighborhood. We need to pay attention. We need to pay attention.
Absolutely brilliant. We made it through transits, Rick. And you didn't even take a drink. I felt like I drank my entire beverage and I wasn't even talking.
Well, I have vodka in my coffee cup, so I can only have so much.
And that's how you sustain. Well, I appreciate
that's Neptune. Vodka would be Neptune. But in fact, I have Mercury Mars, which is in fact coffee.
Coffee. Yeah. Coffee at its finest. Well, I appreciate you coming over to talk to us. This has been awesome.
Cool. Well, I should, in the spirit of crass commercialism, remind people that they can get my daily blogs on Instagram, Instagram at Rick Levine Astrologer, Rick Levine Astrologer, one word. And if you want to follow more of my videos, which I have a wide variety of, some of which you may have seen my free monthly or sometimes occasionally video forecasts or updates. But I have a wide range of other videos, including monthly chart interpretation classes, etc. You can find out all about that on Patreon by going to Patreon, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Rick Levine, patreon.com/Rick Levine. And that way you can follow me elsewhere.
Awesome. And I'll make sure I put all of that under the video as well, so you guys can all check out Rick and follow him. And I like them. I get the daily ones. I read them. I think they're good. I'm always like, that is a great way to say that, because I think in words, like a lot of words.
A lot of words.
A lot of words.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this invitation. And if I hadn't had something to eat before I came on, this instead of an eat and greet for me. But if I was eating, I wouldn't be talking. And so my job here was to talk. So
and you did
thank
it.
you. I hope the sound didn't break up too much. That's been a little bit of a problem. I'm dealing with it.
Yeah, sure. It was like super choppy at areas, then super clear. So we're going to put it out there and just see what it is. And I think people still got a lot out of it. And, you know, I'm always happy to have you back too.
Well, when I come back, hopefully we can have this sound thing figured out. So thank you for the invitation. Always nice to see you.
Yes, you too. All right, you guys, we will see you in the next Eat and Greet, which will actually be coming up on June 4th. We'll have Maurice Fernandez here, and we're going to talk about the great cycles. And just after that, Arlen Wise will be here, and we're going to talk relationships. So we'll see you guys in the next Eat and Greets. Like this video, comment, share, subscribe. Share it like a lot too, though, okay? All right, we'll see you guys next time. Bye, guys.